We'll begin our little Wren class with the painting of some swatches. This is yellow ochre to begin. You can paint swatches on an extra piece of paper, right in your workbook, right on your painting as an added element. The idea of swatches is to make sure that you're comfortable with the progression of colors, the values, and the layering of transparency that you'll be creating. So sometimes when I do swatches, I do them in circles, sometimes in squares. You'll see me paint wet on wet or wet on dry. It's really just kind of a great warm-up exercise. That next one was burnt sienna there. Our next color is going to be a little bit of burnt umber. So you can see we have a beautiful progression of a warm yellow ochre or yellow tone, a red tone, and then of course a deeper brown for our bird. We're going to load in a little bit of Payne's Gray and create the next swatch. And our final swatch here will be a little bit of black. Depending on how you layer your black, we use it often for eyes, toes, beaks. You're going to want a much more opaque black than this, but this will give you an idea of the tone. You could either layer this with 2 coats or paint it darker to begin. We're going to begin with the eye and the beak, and we're going to thin a little bit of black, tap off on paper towel to remove the excess, and let's get the shape of the eye and the inside of the eye painted a solid black color. Sometimes with birds like this, we'll paint the pupil with a little bit of a brown tone, and then or paint the iris with a little bit of a brown tone, and the inside of the eye, the pupil with black. In this case, we're just going to cover the entire eye with black. Then we can get the beak. Now I often start with the back of the beak and pull that brush out towards the tip. And again, another tip for you guys would be to make sure that you try not to go outside the line by starting the paint inside the line of the beak. And then quite often it grows in my case and gets a little bit wider. So try to paint it smaller than you think you want it to be. And in this case, I'm essentially outlining and then pulling that color from the back of the beak out towards the tip. You can leave a little bit of white space if you want. We can also add white space later with white acrylic. So you kind of get to fill it in as you would like. We're going to start with our browns now. So we've got a little bit of burnt umber. Tap the brush off before we begin, and we're going to get started on our bird. And I'm going to also add just a hint of burnt sienna to this color. When you're moving your brush, you're going to use short, choppy little strokes following the growth direction of the bird on this first little streak of brown. And people often ask me, what does the growth direction mean? So if you take a look at the top of the head of the bird, you're going to get a general shape of how that head is moving. So you're going to kind of go parallel to the shape of the top of the head, especially when you're working on the crown area or the little mask inside the bird. And wrens have this beautiful little series of stripes of browns that are different colors. So we're going to get the top of the head based in first around the crown area, leaving a little bit of white space. And what we do is we paint the darker space, leaving the white space around it. As your brush moves across the surface, it will begin to run out of color. We want to allow the brush to run out of color because it leaves a highlight on the crown of the head. And as we go, we can either shade wet on wet, or we can let it dry and shade further, or we can do both. So I'm just adding a little bit of more concentrated brown near the beak to kind of give it a little bit of a shading, and at the back. And as we're working that color in, allow the brush to run out of color and separate your strokes. What I mean by that is if you paint your strokes really close together, it forms a dark, dark area. If you begin to kind of move the brush around and separate out where you lay those strokes down, it will leave you a little bit of highlight. And now we have a very cute, with a very simple color scheme, top of the head there. And you can see where we've left space for lighter color, the white mask on the bird and little brown areas. We can begin to fill in the bottom. Again, look at the shift in direction. So down at the bottom there, it's kind of coming out straight towards the breast. At the front of the throat, it will come out parallel to where you see the line of the throat. And then as we move back under the eye, it goes towards the back of the head. Still mixing those two browns, so a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of burnt umber. When we paint the shadows, we can do one of two things. We can concentrate the color, meaning add less water to it so it's darker, or you could use more burnt umber, which is a darker value than the burnt sienna. So either or a combination of both to shade. Right now, we're just making sure that we have good division of strokes kind of coming into that white mask area, making sure that the white mask, we're calling it a mask, on the wren is nice and defined with some beautiful strokes. You could use a Calia #2 round, a Nyah #2 round. In my hand right now is a Nyah #2 round. In the workbook that we've painted, whether it's a Calia, Nyah, or a Mauve 2 round, you want a 2 round that gives you a very, very beautiful fine point. Nyah is a brush line that is a synthetic Kolinsky sable. It forms an exceptional little point for very, very fine detail. So it's a great brush to work with for little birds and tiny little feather lines. You can see how I switch direction, moving the strokes out towards the front of the bird there. So watch that switch in direction as we come from the front, coming out towards the front there, and then towards the back is parallel to the shape of that head of the bird. One of the greatest tricks we have is to allow the brush to run out of paint in order to make sure that the area that we're painting becomes lighter. So as you're painting, you're going to notice that there's much more concentrated color when you first apply it, and it begins to kind of empty from the middle of the brush as you go. Use that to your advantage in areas that require lighter color, and make sure that while you're painting, you're beginning in the area you think is going to need darker color. So we're just using a little bit of burnt sienna, burnt umber. Every now and then, just touch a little bit into that Payne's gray to give you a little bit of kind of unique cast of a bluish hue, which is really, really beautiful. You don't have to use it very often. Use it very sparingly and just kind of allow it to be an accent. As you're going, I just touched a little bit of browns on there and then rinsed the brush and blotted and blended that out a little bit. Now we're going to pick up a little more of that Payne's gray maybe and a little more burnt umber and burnt sienna and continue throughout the rest of the bird. You'll notice I'm making sure that it's transparent by adding additional water, tapping off, which does a couple things. The tapping off technique makes sure that I'm not going to drop a huge kind of chunk of paint in that area. It also makes sure that it's a little bit more transparent. On the shoulder area with really, really light, gentle color and then shading after, wet on wet, we're applying that color. You'll notice the direction. So there's kind of like a pinpoint at the top of the shoulder, and then the direction is to the left, following the outer edge of the bird. And then on the inside of the bird towards the breast, you'll notice that it kind of curves around that way. And whenever we've got areas of a bird meeting, we're kind of combining those areas a little bit. And by that I mean, we want to make sure there's a couple little dots and dashes where the shoulder meets the breast. Even if it's a firm or harder area that doesn't blend in completely, we still need to make sure that there's a transition between the two areas. Now, this area here, I'm just using really loose kind of wet paint to make sure that I establish. I'm adding more and more water as I go to blend it in. We're still using our browns, occasionally touching in some of that Payne's gray for accent. And actually what we've started with here is the shading underneath the neck. So that neck is lighter at the edge, and then there's a little grouping of shading underneath. You can see we've got that Payne's gray cast in there, and I'm using lots and lots of water to blend it out. Then when I want to add my shading, it can be wet on wet or wet on dry. Add the color, blot the brush, and make sure that you're moving the color outward. We call it walking it out towards the outer edge of the breast. With round objects, they're not perfectly white on the outer edge. They're lighter kind of in a little bit where they're kind of at their fluffiest or fullest area where the light would hit the breast. So we have darkness under the wing and we have darkness on the very right edge of the breast, and then we work them in towards each other to kind of marry up in the middle. So that's that walking technique where we tap or stroke the color using little feathery strokes with the brush, working it in towards the center. A little more Payne's gray in this area, just to make sure that that shadow has a unique color to it. And then we continue playing and working, sometimes using more distinct strokes and working them in, sometimes softening with more water. The beauty of this little project is that I would recommend you start off with softer tones and then you can always layer over top later. But keep it loose and gentle and flowy, and don't worry too much about adding too much color. Just work on growth direction so you establish where those feathers sit. You can always see when I take a pause and do some thinking here as to what the next step is. And of course, allowing it to dry for a couple minutes means anything that you put on top of it is going to sit more distinctly than the previous layer. So let's get some browns and begin our smooth flying feathers. We're going to begin with a light wash of burnt sienna, and you could use a little burnt umber in here. But it's mostly burnt sienna on the distinct primary and covert feathers, just loosely washing it over that area. Having straight burnt sienna gives it a much warmer tone than the burnt umber and the Payne's gray in the other areas, and makes the feathers look more distinct. So even though it's a fairly monochromatic design, the base layer is that burnt sienna, and we're going to take a little bit of burnt umber and define some of those feathers to make sure that we tie the colors in together. Don't be too concerned with whether or not you have 2 feathers or 5 feathers. Just let the hand go where it wants and create some distinction and some separation between different areas. It does not have to be overly specific. This is a very loose painting. And then we drag from the tip of the feather in towards those smaller flying feathers with a little bit more distinct color so we have feathers outlined. And you'll notice with this one, the looser you keep it and the more relaxed, the more gentle she looks. We're going to begin the next step with our little toes. And with these little toes, I always like to start off a little bit lighter than I think we're going to end up, just to establish the shape, the form, and the dimension. So you can use a little bit of yellow ochre here if you want. You could still use burnt sienna as well, but just establish kind of that shape with the leg and the toe coming over the branch. Now pick up a little bit of burnt umber and shade where it comes underneath the breast feathers and just a little bit on each little leg. You're kind of just dashing, dotting, and tapping. Again, does not have to be overly specific. The most important shaded area here is actually where that breast covers the leg. Working on a clipboard is great. It holds the painting in place without having to tape it, so it's a fantastic way to kind of keep it in that same area. We're going to start working on the rump area here, and that's using our burnt sienna, burnt umber mix. I used a little more burnt sienna, and we're just fluffing that little rump over the tail feathers. Then you can shade it with a little bit more burnt umber where it comes behind the wing feather. Same color mix, and you could lean a little more towards the burnt umber tone to make sure that it's got some difference to it. And we're going to just wisp that tail feather up. And I'm using long sweeping strokes with the same size brush just to identify the shape. And then we can fill it in. Again, keep it very, very loose and relaxed. It does not have to be overly distinct feathers with specific highlights or shading, or if you want, it could be. But we wanted this to be just a very light, easy, relaxed design. And we're going to pull a little color from the tip back in. I would, if I were doing it over again, probably have left a little more white space in some of these areas, which you can always add with white acrylic later, but it might have been helpful to have left just a few little whispers of open space in here. That's a little bit of Payne's gray in there. Now what we can do is come in with some darker color. I'm going to shade under the beak with a line of Payne's gray or black. Either one is fine. And then what that does is leave the upper beak lighter. You can reshape the eye, add some little dots and dashes around the eye for distinct feathers, and just play around with some of your detailing here. Sometimes we paint kind of reverse space. So if we have an area we want to keep really, really white, obviously with watercolor it's hard to flick white over top of the darker color. So we sometimes take darker color and push it into the white to make the white look like it's laying over top. Kind of a backwards way of doing it, but that darker color will give us really, really sharp contrast between the white and the area near it. And then let's get our branch. We're going to use the same values, so our burnt sienna and burnt umber. And when we're painting this branch in, you want to have, slightly defined edges in some cases, but then you want to kind of whisk it off into nothingness. And we're not painting a perfectly solid line. Hit and miss, make sure you're moving in the direction that the branch bark would be, but leave some white space if you can and let it kind of float off into the distance. Now with our pen, it's a fine liner. Once the painting is fully dry, I can redefine the circles of the eyes. I can add even more detail spots. That fine liner is a permanent marker. So it's a 0.03 or 0.1 that is going to give you a really fine line. I can use it for the beak, I can use it for miniature feathers, and I can play around with it. Now we're going to use some white acrylic. So any white acrylic that is a good quality acrylic will work, and we're going to take our brush and we're just going to make sure we tap into the acrylic and give ourselves some little dots. Either if you've lost your eye dot in the middle of the eye, this is your time to add it. And we can also add little detailed dots around the eye, on the beak, on the toes. We can highlight feathers. So white acrylic is a great way to refine highlights, to add a pop of bright highlight. The neat thing with acrylic is that it sits on the surface. It does not level in as easily as watercolor does, and it's shinier. So I only use it for what I call the sparkle details. I shouldn't say only, but I most often use it for the sparkle details. Dots on eyes, beaks, redefining bright feathers that are sitting on top of an area. The thing also with acrylic is that once you've added it, watercolor does not like to sit on top of it in the same way. So it is definitely your final step in the painting, unless you're looking for a result where it kind of resists the watercolor. So I hope you take a minute to check out our Beautiful Birds Watercolor Workbook, which is a compilation of some of our favorite birds here at Willow Wolfe. It's a great way to get used to practicing feathers, growth direction, learning new skills, and just relaxing and enjoying into the process. And this is one of the projects from Beautiful Birds. Also check out Nyah Brushes. Nyah is a beautiful synthetic Kolinsky, and don't forget to sign your work. Thank you everybody, and we will see you in the next class.